Many of the children we support are experiencing complex trauma. But what is complex trauma? Let's take a look. One of the most common forms of childhood trauma we see at our clinic is complex trauma. Complex trauma results from exposure to varied or multiple traumatic events. In other words, varied or multiple adverse childhood experiences. This can be any adverse childhood experience. It is the multiple nature of these experiences that result in complex trauma. The most common forms of adverse childhood experience that we see at our clinic that result in complex trauma are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Let's take a look at an example of these multiple adverse childhood experiences. This is Joe. Let's imagine Joe is living with his mum and his dad. Joe's mum and dad have had some difficulty caring for him, and Joe experiences neglect. Sometimes he doesn't have enough food to eat or is cold, and sometimes he's left on his own, not getting the interaction that children would typically get at his age. Neglect is adverse childhood experience number 1. Several of Joe's needs have not been met, and this is having an adverse effect on his ability to grow, develop, and feel safe.
I am not putting up with this anymore.
Putting up with what? I can't talk to people?
I am out of here.
Oh, come on. What? Because I have a little conversation with somebody?
When Joe is a little older, his mum and dad start to argue and fight. He witnesses some of this fighting and can also hear it at night when he's in bed. This domestic violence is adverse childhood experience number 2. Joe is fearful for his safety and the safety of his parents due to the fighting. This fighting also, instead of building his trust in adults, makes him doubt their ability to care for him even more. What we start to see is that one adverse childhood experience compounds another. In this example, Joe's experience of neglect leaves him worrying that adults won't meet his needs. The domestic violence then further compounds that as he feels so unsafe when adults are around. What if Joe experiences another adverse childhood experience? What if he also experiences emotional abuse as his parents blame him for the fighting, telling him they never used to fight before he came along, so he must be to blame? This would be adverse childhood experience number 3, emotional abuse. How much faith would Joe have in adults then? How much faith would he have in himself? Do you think his self-esteem and sense of self-worth would be impacted by these experiences? Of course it would. Joe's self-esteem and sense of self-worth would be hugely impacted by experiences like this. The childhood trauma is less to do with the initial incident itself and more to do with the psychological and emotional impact of a combination of adverse childhood experiences. The multiple nature of adverse childhood experiences can also give weight to the thoughts young people might have about other things. For example, well, it must be my fault because mum and dad never fought before I was around. I'm not good enough to stop them fighting, so they still fight. I'm probably not good enough at anything. That's why they forget I'm here. Maybe I don't always deserve food or a cuddle. That's why they always forget me. You can see how the various and multiple nature of adverse childhood experiences almost provides reasoning to the child around why these experiences are happening. The impact on emotional and psychological well-being is huge, and more often than not, it's internalized, pointing inwards towards the child and impacting on them directly. So this is an example of adverse childhood experiences resulting in complex trauma that has multiple layers. But unfortunately, complex trauma is even more complex than that. Experiencing varied and multiple adverse childhood experiences, including experiences that last for a prolonged time, often results in varied and multiple impacts on children. We've already considered the impact on emotional well-being and how children view themselves, but there can be so many other impacts than that. There can be impacts on development, relationships, emotional and behavioural development, health, and so much more. Any area of development or well-being can be impacted, and the really complex thing is there's often multiple impacts and multiple layers. Things like emotional development. Self-esteem, sense of self-worth, motor development, how a child views their identity can all be impacted by complex trauma. These impacts also impact on each other, making it more difficult for children to heal. Complex trauma is a really complex topic. That's why we have multiple videos in our childhood trauma series about complex trauma. So if you want to know more, make sure you check those out. But before we move on to more trauma-informed care videos, here's a top tip. When supporting children to heal from complex trauma, it's really important to think about the bigger picture. More often than not, there's multiple impacts, and if we just focus on one area, we could be missing some really important things that are also impacting on the child, and this can reduce our chances for success. So my top tip is always think about that bigger picture, and then you can build anything into your care and intervention planning. For more information on childhood trauma and trauma-informed care, subscribe to Tribe for trauma-informed care in practice.